This episode was made possible by private internet access. Browse the web safely and anonymously while changing your IP address to almost any country on Earth. Get 2 months free and prices as low as $3 per month by following my exclusive link below.
When you use a public Wi-Fi hotspot, your data is completely unprotected. Hackers and identity thieves can grab anything. Embarrassing photos, your web history? Start browsing anonymously and only share what you want to share. I actually kind of like this photo. Private internet access. It's time to protect your online privacy.
On this episode of Meet My Inspiration, I'm talking with Andrew McKenna. Andrew's story is just incredible. He went from being a US Federal Prosecutor to becoming profoundly addicted to heroin and eventually to a life as a bank robber. He served some tough years in federal prison but came out of it a new man. He turned his life around and is an advocate for people struggling with addiction and mental health issues. He works now as a National Keynote Speaker, executive speaking coach, and author of Sheer Madness: From Federal Prosecutor to Federal Prisoner. And now, please welcome Andrew McKenna. Welcome, everyone, to Meet My Inspiration. I'm Chris Minyen. My guest today is Andrew McKenna. Andrew, thanks so much for joining me today on Meet My Inspiration.
It's a real pleasure, Chris. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Well, Andrew, let's start at the beginning, I think. Where did you grow up and how would you describe your upbringing?
I grew up in a little town called Schenectady, New York, which is upstate, close to Albany. My upbringing was pretty normal, whatever normal means. My parents were together. I'm the youngest of four, somewhat middle class, I guess, in terms of economics. My father was a college professor. My mom was a school teacher, and it was fairly normal.
After high school, I think you entered into the military, I think the Air Force, and then eventually into the Marine Corps, correct?
Correct. And high school was a sort of a real turning point for me. From like a very young age, I experienced depression and anxiety. It was never really pinpointed or identified. And so I joined the Air Force. I didn't finish high school. I dropped out in the 11th grade. And it was almost like, run for the hills. I had to do something different at really a young age. At 14, 15, I started, I mentioned the depression, the anxiety. I started to self-medicate with alcohol and pot and stuff like that. So,
what age?
The whole
sorry,
thing,
Andrew, but at what age did the drinking and smoking pot begin?
It's probably, between 13 and 14 years old. And it started very innocently. I hung out with guys that were a couple of years older than me. We were all athletes, and the first beer that I had, Chris, it brought my anxiety levels down, and I could kind of function. And same with the pot. Yeah.
Just immediately.
Yeah, immediately. I remember the first beer I ever drank, at a buddy's house with like 3 or 4 guys over. As I said, they were a couple of years older than me, but I was on their sports teams. And man, it was like, I found the answer to my insecurities and anxiety, feeling less than, all those things.
It sounded like you had a pretty healthy family life. Was it ever discussed amongst your family, your depression, your anxiety? Was there any treatment ever for that?
No, it wasn't discussed. And, to their credit, I mean, they were fairly progressive parents. But no, it was never diagnosed, no treatment, no therapy or anything. And I was too young and too naive to know to ask for it too.
Yeah, you probably didn't even recognize what was wrong with you. You just felt out of place, right?
Absolutely out of place. And I write a little bit about this, but I'll just go back. But when I was 8 years old, I literally remember having thoughts like existential thoughts, like, why am I here? What's this all about? Thinking about in terms of life and existence and, God and it just, so looking back, I remember it, but as an 8-year-old, how could I possibly have been thinking those things? So I I wasn't a deep thinker, slightly, above average in intelligence, very slightly, right? So it's not that. It was just, I don't know. I was somehow a little bit different and didn't know whether to express that or not.
Well, again, so after you dropped out of high school, you ran for the hills, you ran to the military. I think you spent about a total of 10 years in the military, in the Air Force and the Marine Corps combined. Could you tell me about that period of your life?
Sure. So my first older brother, Brian, sat me down when I was about 17, and he says, "You need to do something because, at this point I'm skipping school. I quit sports teams. I'm hanging out with the wrong crowd." And he saw the writing on the wall. Super intelligent guy, my brother. And one of his best friends had just joined the Air Force, and he said, "Why don't you go talk to the Air Force recruiter?" And then, Chris, like, my life changed completely. I mean, I went from small town Schenectady. I went through a training period in Florida. My first duty assignment was Hawaii. So here I am, this 18-year-old kid, from this tiny little town. Everybody thinks that you're from New York, so that everybody thinks it's New York City, but it wasn't. I lived in like the farmlands,
Yeah.
Great shape, 18 years old, running wild. It was like the greatest experience to really kick off what became somewhat of an interesting life and, new experiences. It was kind of cool.
How was the depression? How was the anxiety during that period? Did it subside because you were kind of living the life, as you put it?
Yeah, the depression subsided. And, there's a lot of, at least there was then, a lot of drinking in the military, and booze was cheap. You could buy it on base, and lots of parties and stuff. So I think that, I just started ramping up to like 100 miles an hour. So the depression came down, but what didn't change was constantly thinking about things. And I couldn't quiet my mind. And I was old enough at that point to start realizing that this was an issue for me. Outwardly everything was great, but internally something still just didn't seem right with me.
Did it ever occur to you to try to seek out therapy or some kind of help?
There was a chaplain, an Air Force chaplain, that I spoke to once at a gathering, at a picnic or something. And we were talking a little bit, and somehow he was able to pick up on something that was going on with me. And maybe he was identifying, the racing mind that I always had. And so we talked a little bit, and he said, that's probably something that you should talk more about to people and someone that you trust. And I absorbed what he was saying to me, Chris, but I didn't really act on it. Again, I'm having fun. My job in the Air Force was literally I was attached to an Army infantry unit, and I was a forward air controller, what's called a ROMAD. And I would be on the ground with a radio directing pilots to drop bombs on targets. So, you can imagine. And, I've traveled to the Philippines and other countries to do exercises. So I never really took his advice. I just kept going.
So after the Air Force, you made your way to the Marine Corps for nearly 6 years, I think. What were you doing in the Marine Corps?
So after I left the Air Force, I moved back to New York and finished my undergraduate degree. I had no idea what to do with my life. My oldest brother had just graduated from law school, and he said, well, take the LSAT, right? Take the admissions test. And he said, the great thing about law school is you commit for 3 years and you don't have to think about life for 3 years because you're already locked into this thing. So I went in cold, took the LSAT, did okay on it. And, so the next logical step was, all right, well, apply to law schools. And, I was accepted. And then my oldest brother then gave me this advice. because as he graduated, he went as an associate lawyer to a law firm, and he hated it. And you know, he said, don't do that because you're young and you know, you want to do these different things. He said, how about the Marine Corps? And I'm thinking, Marine Corps, I'm thinking back to my Air Force days, thinking, wow, these guys are really, I mean, Air Force is cool, but it's not the Marine Corps. I mean, Marines are Marines, you know, first and last style. I was always intrigued by them, and I was scared to death of going in. But I went to an officer recruiter in Albany, New York, and said, okay. And he said, well, what do you want to do? You know, as a lawyer in the Marines. I said, well, I want to go through all the training every other officer has to go through, which the Army, Navy, and Air Force just put you through a 2-week shoot and salute school. Marine Corps make their officers, they don't care what you do. You have to go through the full training, which is the most amazing training in the world. And he said, well, what do you want to do as a lawyer? And I said, I want to be in the courtroom. I want to do trial work. And he said, anything else? I said, no, I just want to do trial work. And he laughed. And he wasn't a lawyer. He was an infantry officer. He goes, well, I can guarantee you'll get trial experience. So that's what I did. I that was before I started law school. So law school started in the fall. I went to officer candidate school in the summer in Quantico. And so when I started my first year of law school, I had a haircut like yours, nice and short, clean cut. You know, now I look like kind of like a savage, but back then, you know, and I started law school. And then in the summers, I could go to bases, Marine Corps bases. And even as a first and second year law student, they'd put you in the courtroom. And so I was just getting this trial experience. And then I'd go back to law school for the next semester. And I had already had like administrative hearings. I second chaired a couple courts martial. It was just, you know, it was awesome. You know, it was really, really good.
And you got tons of experience, which probably will help explain your next position after the Marine Corps. So when your military career came to an end, you went on to work with the US Attorney's Office, and then eventually on to become a federal prosecutor. So for those that don't know, could you describe your work as a federal prosecutor?
Sure. It's for many, many attorneys, it's a dream job. It's an important job. It has a ton of responsibility. I mean, your job is to do justice, it's to pursue cases, go after people who've committed, serious crimes, not so serious crimes, but there's a lot of judgment involved too. And we read about, overreaching from prosecutors, and there's always a lot of that. But I learned from really the best of the best. I worked at the Eastern District of Virginia U.S. Attorney's Office, which is called the Rocket Docket. And it's comparable to like the Southern District of New York in terms of the types of cases and the prestige of the office. And here I am, just this young, nearly brand new attorney, did a few years in the Marines, a little bit of background, and it was my dream job. It was amazing. But here's an interesting little fact, and it kind of ties in later in the story. I went to Albany Law School in upstate New York. It's a wonderful, wonderful school. It's competitive, great professors, great program, but it's not a Harvard. It's not Yale. It's not Duke. It's not Stanford, right? So most of the people hired by DOJ are from these pedigree schools. So I found myself feeling really, it kind of fed into my natural insecurity that I had as a little boy, so I felt like I had to work twice as hard. And I'll tell you, that's exactly what I did. It was nose to the grindstone. What would take someone 2 hours maybe to write a motion for federal court, it would take me longer. I didn't want that. I wanted to be as good as, if not better, than my coworkers, a healthy competition. And then so I went from there. And for your listeners, when I talk about the responsibility, it's not to increase the win-loss column. It's not just to put people in prison. It's to judge the case, assess what is a fair charge to bring against them, and then to win, and to win at trial, and to do justice, though, is the bottom line. And I see a lot of offices that get away from that, but certainly not the Eastern District of Virginia. I had a great coach named Gene Rossi. I won't get into it too much, but he was 30 years with DOJ, had more trials than any prosecutor in DOJ history, just a phenomenal man. But it was the best, man. I was so happy, and I took so much pride in what I was doing and the work that I was putting in. It's awesome.
That's amazing. So you mentioned your officer candidate school training with the Marines. While you were taking part in that training, you suffered a pretty bad fall and you hurt your back quite badly. So when you started working as a federal prosecutor, you said that you put on a bit of weight, and the back pain returned, and it was kind of a problem for you at that point. I think you were medicating with, aspirin or, basic stuff like that, but it just wasn't doing the trick. So eventually you found yourself visiting a doctor. And how did the doctor suggest you manage that pain?
Well, so two things were going on. One, I did really hurt my back in the Marines, and it was during the basic school, which is the 6 months of this unbelievable training. It's very, very difficult, and you really get a taste for, taking 270 officers, young lieutenant officers that really don't know anything, and, training them, moving them from A to B, the logistics of it. There's a lot of hurry up and wait, but the training is awesome, and but a lot of it's gruesome. I fell down a cliff during night land navigation by myself out in the woods. And, even though Schenectady is a small town, it's still a city. So I wasn't a country boy by any means. So navigating through the woods at night was a real challenge for me. During the day, I was great. But at night, I used terrain association to navigate. And at night, you can't really see the terrain. Anyhow, so I fall down a cliff. I hear this crack in my back. I was disoriented. I was knocked out. I made it through that portion of the training. But here's the point, Chris. I couldn't go to anyone and say that I was injured, because I'd either have to go back in training, start all over, or go be put into an injured lieutenant company and wait for my injuries to heal. Can't tell anybody. Once I went to DOJ, I put on the weight. Oh, so during the Marines, I treated it just as you said, Motrin, aspirin, heating pads, that kind of thing, and grinned and bared it, gutted it out. But once I went to DOJ, I'm traveling, hotels, eating, drinking, putting on weight, back injury comes back. I go to the doctor, and great doctor, but kind of old school in his prescribing practices. And he suggests Loratab. Well, Loratab for most people is a great medication. We have to be able to treat pain. Doctors have to be able to do that. But for a guy like me, Loratab is not a great medication because it's an opioid. And opioids are the no feel, no deal drug for somebody who's, depressed, anxious, feelings of insecurity, all those untreated things that I carried into my adulthood from my childhood, right? So Loratab was like that first drink when I was 13 or 14. It brought down all my insecurities. Now, here's the thing. It's kind of unusual because I was gaining a reputation as being pretty good at what I did, at least hardworking. And so my career path, the trajectory was kind of going like this. Well, more like this. But I still felt all these feelings of insecurity. And, when are they going to find out that I'm not as good as they think I am? All these feelings. When's that shoe going to drop? And opioids took that feeling away. So I kept going and kept going, self-medicating.
Now you're saying Loratab. I think, is it better known as Percocet? Is that the same thing?
So Loratab is hydrocodone. Percocet's, I guess, one step higher, which is oxycodone. And then the highest level is OxyContin, and we can talk about that in a minute. But,
Sure, we're definitely going to get to that.
yeah,
and
man.
I think
that
once
was really, yeah.
once you started taking that medication, it got out of hand pretty fast. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So he would prescribe me, a month's supply or 2 weeks supply, and that was okay for the first month. But then the second script would be gone in 4 or 5 days, and I really enjoyed them. I liked them. I wouldn't say that I was hooked on them, but I really liked them. And so he knew I was a prosecutor with the Justice Department, and he liked that. We would talk about my cases when I went to see him. I'd make sure that my credentials and this little black thing with the badge were out where he could see them as time progressed. Not in the beginning, but as time progressed, because what I was doing was I'd call him from, let's say, Los Angeles, and he was in DC. I'd say, Doc, I lost my script, or I left my script in a hotel. No problem, Andrew, I'll write you another one. So now I'm taking, hydrocodone, oxycodone, and I'm eating these things like chiclets, right? And all of a sudden, you know what else I developed? Attention deficit disorder. So you know what? Well, Doc, could you prescribe me some Ritalin? I heard that really works well. And, and he's like, yeah, but I want you to make sure you be very careful with it. Of course, Doc, look, I understand, I prosecute drug cases, so I get these things. What a bunch of bullshit I was feeding him, but I didn't want the supply to end, and he would even prescribe Viagra a little bit, but we don't need to talk about that.
That's a personal issue, I guess.
Yeah,
so I want to know,
that's a silly joke.
I want to know, did you have any other addictions prior to that? And I think it's safe to say that you did develop an addiction to those pills, maybe not early on, but at some point you were hooked on them. Prior to that, was there any trouble with alcohol or other hard drugs? Or you said you were smoking pot and drinking, things like that. It was kind of intense, but do you think you were addicted to anything prior to that?
I don't think so. Because I had stopped smoking pot. I definitely was drinking heavily, but I wouldn't say at that point I was, clinically alcoholic. So no cocaine, no methamphetamine or anything like that. But alcohol use definitely. Look, I hung out, I worked with, DEA, FBI, ATF parties. DEA are no slouches either. FBI is a little bit more buttoned up and careful, but, so I was living a life of traveling the world, really going 100 miles an hour. So alcohol was an issue. But if you ever wanted to discuss gateway stuff, I can go back to marijuana.
Really?
Well, for me, because marijuana and beer at such a young age made me feel better, and so like a lot of doctors and clinical types will disagree with the term addictive personality. I firmly believe that I do have that. So, Chris, what it did for me was it made me relax, feel better about myself, and not worry. So if that's good, if marijuana and weed is good, marijuana and a little bit of alcohol is good, then something else must be even a little bit better. And that's right where my mind went. And that's where, it's not a gateway drug for everybody. Most of my friends smoke pot daily, and we're fairly successful. So for them, maybe not, but for me, I wanted to feel a little bit better. And so I inched up the scale to harder drugs.
Well, you mentioned that you were traveling a lot, and you took a trip to Houston in the early 2000s. You were working on a major worldwide ecstasy case. You were using drugs very heavily at that point. You were drinking a lot. You were even using cocaine. So after a major bust in that case, you arrived at the DEA office, I think, and there were all kinds of evidence Laid out there. There were drugs, there were guns, there was cash, all kinds of stuff. You found a Rolex watch, and for some reason, you decided to steal it. Can you describe what happened after you stole that watch?
After I stole the watch, I'd come off a night of partying by myself. We had just taken down one of the largest cases in the country's history in terms of ecstasy, the number of countries involved, Israel, the Netherlands, Germany, United States. It was massive. We worked with Interpol. We worked with, agencies from all over the world. It was a big deal. And I, being a fairly young attorney still, I led that. And, I didn't lead it. The agents led it. They get the credit. I worked with some of the best, brightest, hardworking DEA agents, task force, FBI was involved. They did it. I handled the legal side of things. We executed, I don't know, maybe 15 to 18 search warrants all at once that particular morning, as soon as the sun came up. Well, when the sun came up and the agents are executing the search warrants and the arrests, I'm walking out of a club. And I had done cocaine, which was never my thing, but I had done some the night before, drank, the pain kit pills, everything. And so the next morning, agent comes, picks me up at the hotel, brings me to the office, as you described, just as you described it. Evidence bags everywhere, piles of cash, guns, everything, drugs, jewelry. So I'm sitting there, Chris, and somebody puts a small styrofoam cup of black coffee in front of me. Don't remember who. I'm still literally in a stupor. I sip the coffee, and something shiny is to my left on the table in an open evidence bag. It hadn't been sealed yet because it was still being inventoried. And I look at it, and my best memory of this is I reach in, I look at it, and I put it in my bag. I carried a briefcase bag with me, my work bag, right? Files, pads, and stuff. I leave, and I go to the US Attorney's office, which is separate from the DEA office. And, I was a Washington, D.C. lawyer. So I was coming in from Washington, it's like the old thing. I'm from Washington. I'm here to help. And, so I was kind of on their turf. So they gave me this little office, and I get a call from the case agent, Keith Brown, one of the best agents you can imagine, investigators, just intuitive, honest, just an amazing brain. And we had worked together for 11 months together. We were like brothers. We got a roving wiretap approved. We had all these things, all these small victories. So he calls me and he goes, "How are you feeling?" I said, "Well, I kind of hung over." He goes, "Yeah, I bet." And he goes, "We got a problem." And I said, "What?" And he said, "We're missing evidence." And I said, "Well, what are you talking about? I mean, what do you mean? What are we missing?" He said, "We're missing a Rolex watch." And then there was silence on the phone. Now, as I said, he and I had become almost as close as brothers for 11 months. And that silence hit me in my gut. Something struck me that this wasn't right. I'd never felt something like this dealing with Keith. And he goes, "Well, we'll figure it out." So about 10 minutes later, he shows up in my office at the U.S. Attorney's office. And Chris, this guy he wasn't a rogue cop. He was a great cop. Okay. Great agent. But I mean, picture him like he was slightly overweight. He'd carry a pistol in his waistband, instead of holstered up like a regular law enforcement officer. And he sits across from me, and he's got this big bag, like a bag you'd bring to the gym. You like to wear your workout clothes. He didn't carry bags, he didn't even wear a sport coat or a tie, right? And I noticed the bag, and something occurred to me. I don't know what occurred to me, but I noticed it. And he said, "Andrew, we got a real problem here. We're missing evidence." And I said, yeah, you told me over the phone. He goes, well, what are we going to do? And Chris, he looked at me, and excuse me if I tear up a little bit, but he looked at me, and when he said, what are we going to do? He was telling me, I think you took it. I think you have it. And I said, well, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to get everybody that was in that room that had any connection or closeness, proximity to that watch. We're going to question them, and we're going to polygraph them. And you know what he said to me? He goes, we're going to polygraph everyone. And I said, everyone. And he said, including you? At that point, I said, Keith, what's going on here? He goes, Andrew, call your boss in Washington, D.C. I said, well, what do you mean? He goes, Andrew, you need to call your boss. So he had already figured it out that it was me. As I said, he was his most intuitive man. And he knew that I was the only one in the room with that evidence, because they had all left to go to a debriefing. And they don't bring lawyers to debriefings, right? For constitutional reasons. But they had to, debrief the takedown and make sure everything was done properly. So I was the only one in the room when I took the watch. And so I reached down in my bag, and I reach around, and I start to pull out. The first thing my hand grabs onto was a prescription bottle of Percocet. And I didn't pull it out enough for him to see it. I was behind my desk. And I reach back down, I feel around, and I pull out the Rolex watch. And he goes, call your boss. And I handed him the watch. It was one of the most powerful moments. My life came crashing down at that point.
Well, I'm going to fast forward a little bit on your story here. That was a big turning point in your life. So basically, you were fired from your job. Luckily, they didn't bring charges against you. You were able to work again as a lawyer, and that's what you did. Your family, I think you moved back to your hometown, or you moved back to Albany. You got work as a lawyer there, a pretty decent job, I think. But you weren't able to get your prescriptions met there for your back pain, or maybe your addiction at this point, whichever was more powerful. And so you ran out of your medication. So you contacted a friend, and your friend said, well, I can get you some OxyContin, which is a much more powerful drug. Could you describe the difference quickly between what you were taking for the most part and OxyContin?
So when you run out of Percocet or hydrocodone, and you don't take them for a few days, you feel kind of crappy. You feel like you have a cold. You're kind of, uncomfortable, but manageable, right? So I called my friend and I said, can you get me some Percocet? Can you get me Loratab or Percocet? And he goes, no, I can't. He said, but I can get OxyContin. I'd heard of OxyContin because as a prosecutor, OxyContin had just come on the scene. And in West Virginia, people were taking this new drug and dying, overdosing. And very offensive term, but they were calling it hillbilly heroin because there was a lot of Appalachia folks that were dying. So I was a little intrigued, I'm like, well, but it's still a pill. But really, Chris, OxyContin is heroin in a pill form. So I remember, making my way to his house. I took a couple OxyContin, and it's like Percocet times 100. So the feeling was like, wow, this is awesome. This is intense. And those feelings of insecurity and all that stuff, again, completely gone. And so I'm taking this OxyContin, and, what I didn't realize was the addictive properties of it. I figured, it's just like Percocet. Yeah, if I run out, that's fine. I'll feel crappy, but I'll get more. So I'm taking OxyContin, 80 milligram OxyContins, the big green ones. And my tolerance level is building quickly. So after a few days, I'm taking 2 or 3 of these at $40 a pop, but I'm making great money. I was at one of the top firms. And so I'm like, but my tolerance grew. I'm taking more and more. And he was completely broke. The writing was on the wall. I went in, he didn't have any furniture. He'd sold his PlayStation. I'm like, what, I didn't really. So, but every time I went to him, I had to buy a couple for him, right? He wasn't going to tell me his source, right? It's typical. And he was in the compulsion stage of addiction, so I can't really blame him. However, to his credit, he accepts responsibility. So what happens? I'm sitting in my office one day. I hadn't had an OxyContin for about a day and a half or 2 days. And I start sweating. And my stomach tightens up. And all of a sudden, my skin starts crawling. And I get nauseous. I have a client in the waiting room. Okay. I'm about to go see a client. So I called him quickly on my office phone. And I said, what the hell is going on? I feel awful. I said, I think I have the flu. Hey, by the way, were you able to get any more oxys? And he said, no, you don't have the flu, bud. You're just going through withdrawals. I'm like, what? He goes, yeah, you're going through withdrawals. So I grabbed the waste paper basket and I throw up. Like it just came up suddenly on me. I didn't even know. And it kept happening and kept happening. And so I buzzed my secretary and I said, can you tell the client we have to reschedule? I have to go. Family emergency. So I leave my office. I call him first and I said, dude, what's going on? I said, I'm sick. He goes, yeah, these are withdrawals, man. You're going through it right now. I'm like, well, why the, F didn't you tell me? I mean, what is this? Get some more oxys. And he says, no, Chris. He says, no. He goes, George got arrested. I said, George? He goes, yeah, the guy you get the oxys from. I said, well, call somebody else. And he goes, there's no one else. I'm like, what kind of fucking drug dealer are you? Pardon my language on your podcast.
No problem.
And he goes, I said, well, you're not sick. How come you're not sick? And he goes, he started, and I've known this kid since kindergarten, my buddy. And he goes, well, I don't know. I'm sure I am sick. I said, no, you're not. I can hear your voice. I said, so I'm thinking he must be holding back. He has more oxys just for himself. And he goes, I swear to God, I don't have any more oxys. Finally, he says, look, Andrew, just come over. Chris, I have never gotten from Albany, New York to Schenectady, New York. It's about 25 minutes. I got there in like 9 minutes. I walk in, I have vomit on me. I'm sweating, I'm pale. I walk in and he looks me in the eye and he said, I never wanted to do this. I said, do what? And he points at the table, his kitchen table, and there's a little mirror on it. In the center of the mirror, there's a tiny little bit of tan powder. I'd never seen heroin before, other than as a prosecutor in 50, 60, 70 kilo bricks. And he goes, I don't want to do this. Meaning he didn't want to show me heroin. But he goes, it's the only way you're going to feel better. I sniffed that little bit of heroin. Within 5 seconds, sweating stopped, everything stopped. I felt like $1 million. That was my first introduction to heroin.
Not a good introduction, ultimately.
No.
You snorted it, I guess, the first little while. You quickly moved on to injecting it intravenously. Heroin took control of your life. Things really spiraled out of control very badly, fairly quickly, I do believe. You were spending hundreds of dollars a day on heroin. Well, how much heroin were you using and how much money were you spending?
At the height of it, so a bundle of heroin is 10 bags. It looks about the size of a postage stamp, a bag. And A bundle is 10 of those. And a bundle costs about $100. And so I was doing 5 to 6 bundles a day, which is an
that
enormous amount.
How much would an average heroin user use? A bundle or a bag, or how much?
So probably like an average, I can't even say recreational user because there's no such thing when it comes to heroin, but maybe a bundle a day.
You're using 5 to 6 times that.
Yeah, sometimes a little bit more.
And just spending hundreds of dollars. And it's a kind of a long story, but we'll kind of cut to the chase here. Eventually, the gig was up. You were married. You had 2 children. Your wife found out what was going on. Your boss at the law firm found out what was going on. You were fired from your job. And you entered into a rehab facility, a pretty rough rehab facility, I think. You were in the rehab facility for a period of months, and for a while it took hold. You were able to get clean, but unfortunately, when you finished rehab, you returned home, and there was some pretty bad news waiting for you. What was that?
So I came home. Let me say this first. It wasn't fun. The enjoyment of using is not fun. I mean, it's fun in the very beginning because it makes you feel great. But at the time when the wheels came off the bus, I was just using enough not to get sick. And it's hard. It wasn't fun. I wasn't living it up. I was miserable. I was living a life of utter hell, just worrying, trying to make sure I had enough so I wouldn't get violently ill. The withdrawals are, think the flu and plus mono plus pneumonia times 50, and I am not exaggerating. So I go through rehab. I'm doing fairly well. There probably wasn't enough of addressing my mental health issue, which was depression, anxiety, fear. So I get out. I go to an outpatient clinic. I'm going 3 or 4 nights a week. I come home, and the house was dark, and the car was gone. My wife at the time had taken our 2 young sons and left. And I'm not blaming her for that. At the time I did. I blamed everybody. But looking back, she was in survival mode, and she had to protect herself and our children. It was crushing. And I'm not looking for sympathy. I created this. I'm responsible for everything that happened. It's even with, a horrifying addiction, the person with that addiction ultimately is still responsible to ask for help.
Of course. Well, that was a devastating blow to you, especially to have your children taken away from you. But there was kind of a nice period of time, I guess, following that. I mean, you managed to stay clean for a period of time. I think at some point you found a new girlfriend that you cared a lot about. You were even working again, not in your field of expertise, but you were working at I think a recycling plant or something like that.
Yeah, I ran a scale. Trucks would come in. I'd have to weigh them. Work is work. Look, work is work. I would have to be alive. But
the having your kids taken away from you really messed with you a lot, I think, and it would anybody, I think. Added on top of that, your ongoing mental health issues, as you said, your anxiety, your depression, and on top of that, you were working, but it wasn't a high-paying job, and so unfortunately, I think you weren't able to pay the child support even. So there was a lot of pressure. There was a lot going on in your head, and at some point, you just kind of broke. You started using again. Is that correct?
I did, and this is what led up to it. My wife at the time would not cooperate with me whatsoever. She wouldn't allow me to speak to the children. I had to see them it was any visitation had to be supervised by a stranger who had a pet rat, of all strange things, and I'm terrified of rats. Anyhow, the family court judge was an awful judge. And even being this far removed from it, and I'm objective and I accept responsibility, I have no problem saying that they did not cooperate. It's an awful system for a man, and perhaps a woman as well, to navigate the family court system if the judge is unfair. My depression went to the point where I wanted to kill myself. I couldn't live, Chris, with the idea of not seeing my little boys. I couldn't. And so the depression, my fear, my anger just culminated. And then one day I picked up again. I didn't want to feel what I was feeling. It was either use or kill myself, and it was such a profound, deep pain that I couldn't even imagine it could be that bad, So I'm responsible for then picking up and using. And then things continued to get worse.
Yeah, well, your habit, your found again habit, it got really bad really quick, as things tend to do, like that. And
right.
you were back to your previous levels of use, maybe even more, I don't know. But unfortunately, you didn't have the high paying job this time. You had a low paying job. Right. So you were simply unable to pay for this expensive habit. So I want to know, was there a period of time where you were like, okay, how can I pay for this habit? Did you have a series of ideas, or was it just one?
I had one idea, and I remember how it kind of came together. I had a friend that I grew up with, brilliant kid named Matt. And Matt had done some time for robbery. He had earlier on, he had a cocaine addiction, and he robbed some grocery store. No, he robbed some 7-Elevens or something. And he ended up doing state time, I think 3.5 years. Brilliant man. I mean, could have done anything with his life. But he had gotten out, and we had reconnected somehow. And I asked him, I said, Matt, do you think I could do jail time? And he said, yeah, you could. And then I asked him, it was more of like a philosophical question. And I said, why? Why do you think that? And he said, because you're not a mark. And he said, you're not someone that they're going to target. They're going to go for the low-hanging fruit, the weak. So you would survive it. And I thought to myself, So I had this idea that, I could survive jail. And one day I'm at my job weighing trucks at the scale. And I Googled the United States sentencing guidelines, which I used to have as a prosecutor, right? It's basically a manual set up by Congress, initiated by Sentencing Commission. And so you look up the crime, and then there's aggravating factors. Basically, you come up with a numerical indicator, and that's what the judge uses to sentence you to a range. So I looked up bank robbery, and I had prosecuted bank robbery cases, but I had forgotten the guidelines. And so I read it, and I'm like, So continued to weigh trucks, went home. My life continued to spiral. My only saving grace was the girl that I was with, Dawn. She doesn't know this, but she kept me alive, right? And so one day I'm driving to family court, and I knew that I would test positive for opioids. And I knew that would be another setback, Now I would only be able to see my kids once every 3 months or something. And all of it kind of came in, it just flooded me. This massive feeling of despair and fear and not wanting to live. And so I'm driving north in New York, and instead of taking the exit to go to my family court hearing, I took the next couple exits up, the Lake George exit. Lake George is like a vacation town on this beautiful lake near the in the Adirondacks Park, I believe, or just short of it. But it's this awesome place. And I was on autopilot. I'll never forget. I'm driving, I'm holding the wheel. I pass the exit for family court, and I take the Lake George exit, and I went to the first bank I saw, and I robbed it.
Obviously, it sounds a bit insane to most people, that thought process of asking your friend, could I do prison time, even considering robbing a bank. The reason I asked you, were there other ideas in place? Most people would think of something lower level, like break into somebody's house and, you know, steal stuff out of their house and go sell it or whatever. Robbing a bank, it's you're crossing an incredibly rare line. It's an environment where you could potentially get killed instantly.
Right.
Obviously,
or even worse, someone else get killed.
Yeah, sure. And of course, there's the prison time that you mentioned, but it doesn't seem that you were afraid.
So here's the piece of it that I still don't fully understand. You know, I've been labeled by therapists and clinicians, you know, risk-taking personality, a number of other things. And I know that about myself, you know. And I think it can be a strength and also a great weakness. I'm not an excitement junkie. Like, I hate roller coasters, you know? So it wasn't that. But there's something, part of my ontology, I believe, caused me to choose bank robbery over any other thing. And I don't know. I was clearly out of my mind. You know, I mean, I was out of my mind. But I'll never forget that day when I walked in that first bank.
Well, let's hear about that.
So again, I'm supposed to go to family court, so I had a suit and tie on, and there was a baseball cap in my little truck that I had, given to me by my AA sponsor. Great guy, unbelievable guy, Greg. Anyhow, I put my baseball cap on, of course, the Yankees cap, and I walk into the bank, and I remember I couldn't feel my feet. Like, I couldn't feel the steps that I was taking. It was almost like I was floating in. And I went to this little table, you know, with the pens that are in the holders, and I took out like a deposit slip, little piece of paper, and I wrote my demand note. And it said something like, I have a gun, no alarms, give me hundreds, 50s, 20s, no alarms. And I got in line, and there's one guy ahead of me in line. He got called up, and then I got called up, and I looked at the teller, and you know, she looked at me.
How are you feeling at that?
Sorry
for interrupting, but I want to know, how were you were you completely freaking out inside? Were you calm and cool? What was going on inside you at that time?
Well, one thing was, I wasn't high at all. So this wasn't under the influence. Certainly I had it in my system from days prior. I was feeling this feeling of incredible intensity, this incredible energy, and this feeling of control, a feeling of control that I'd never had in the past year, you know, through family court, through, you know, the pending charges hanging over my head with DOJ for taking the watch, all of these things, I didn't have control over my life. The addiction, my depression, my mental health issues. But all of a sudden, I had control. You know, I didn't have control over the teller. It wasn't control over someone else. It was like an internal control. And that's what I was feeling. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel nervousness or anxious. I felt a certain calm.
So then you handed the note to the teller, and what happened next?
So I hand the note to the teller, and she looks at the note, looks up at me, and then quickly looks away. And she goes into her drawer, and she took out the money in the drawer. And she said, like this. And she was asking me if she was handing me the money properly. And it's something I'll never get out of my head. The fear that she felt was just too much, you know, and look, I wake up about it, you know. And think
So,
about her.
of course, that's a horrible position. It's okay. It's a horrible position to put somebody in, and anybody should feel bad about that, I would think. So you got the money. How much did you get, and what happened next?
I got a few $1,000s, maybe close to 3,000. Got in my car that I'd left running, and drove to my guy's house and got heroin.
Yeah.
And immediately used it.
And immediately upon getting the cash in hand, you're kind of leaving the bank for the first time, you're driving away. You felt pretty good, right? You felt pretty exhilarated, I think. Is that correct?
Yeah, I did. I guess that's when this sort of like the rush happened. You know, it's like, oh my God, I can't believe, wow, this is nuts. And I just remember turning on the radio really, really loud. And I wasn't thinking about her. I wasn't thinking about having committed a crime. It was just like, holy crap, you know, and I'm tearing ass down the highway.
You might have found a new high at that point, yeah?
It was a new high. That's interesting you say that, because as you know, I'd robbed more banks.
Yeah. But we're going to talk about that right now. So the first robbery, the cash, it didn't last all that long. I think when people imagine robbing a bank, they think you're just immediately rich, but it's just a couple $1,000s, maybe at best, usually, maybe more. I don't know, but you know, it's not a lifetime supply of money. And I think it was maybe a week later that you were broke again. You were out of heroin. You were dope sick, going through withdrawals. So you decided to rob a second bank using the same method as the first. And it pretty much went about the same. You got your cash from that robbery. And again, you immediately set out to get some more heroin, but your regular dealer, I think, was in jail at that point. So you had to just go on a random street corner to try to get some heroin. So you rolled up to a dealer, told him what you wanted. He got into the car, and what happened next?
So he gets in the car, and I'm in, kind of a bad neighborhood. And I told him what I wanted, a bundle. And it's a small car. He's like, so we're really close to each other. And as I was reaching into my pocket to get my money out, I had kind of a stack of money because I'd committed a robbery a day or two before. And as I'm taking the money out, I feel cold steel on my temple. And so he's pointing a gun at my head. He's got his gun to my head. And when people talk about your life flashing through your eyes, it had never happened to me until that point. And I know we're limited on time, but you can imagine all the visions of children and childhood and my parents. And, feelings of love and hate and fear and all these things just flashed. And the next thing I hear is a metal on metal clinking sound. And I knew from my time in the Marine Corps what had happened. His gun had jammed. He'd pulled the trigger and the gun jammed. So his intention either, or maybe he accidentally pulled it, but I almost had my head blown off. And within a nanosecond, he grabs my money and starts to go. At the same time, I'm pushing the weapon away, and I get his shoulder. And so he's trying to get out. I'm trying to get him out. And then the next thing I do is I just gun it and tear it down the street. And talk about a drug deal gone wrong, right? By the grace of God, I'm
could have been worse, right? Yeah, absolutely. That's an incredible story. So during your period of time robbing banks, and I think there was a couple of supermarkets in there as well, did you have any really close calls? Did you have any, for you, any kind of scary experiences during that period?
I did. You mean in relation to the robberies?
Yeah.
There was one. There was a couple. One, I was in line behind a guy that I'm almost certain was a cop or a retired cop, and he wore kind of like a vest that maybe like a fly fisherman would wear. You see a lot of like cops wear stuff like that to hide their weapon. But I was already in line and I was already committed to doing it. And that same feeling of calm and control, internal control, came over me. So I didn't abort the mission, but I was almost certain. In fact, I played it out in my mind that he would still be in the bank when the woman would hit an alarm. And in fact, so it didn't happen, but I thought for sure I would be caught at that moment. I was never so sure. So it snapped me out of my calm and my feeling of control too. And then the panic set in. So, and oddly enough, when I get up to the teller, she's looking at the note, looking at me. And as she starts to turn to get into her drawer, this hand goes over here. And I'm pretty sure she hit the alarm. And so I grabbed the money while she's still putting money out. And I just grab it, some falls, and I run out. And that guy, who I thought was a cop, was walking down the sidewalk. I ran by him. We were the only two on the sidewalk. I took a quick left, got in my car, and drove off. But I was certain he was a cop. And that goes back to, I endangered everybody's life. And at that point, I don't know these people, but at that point, their life, in my eyes, looking back, were worth more than my life tenfold. I didn't want to live, man. Yeah. At that point, I just didn't want, the robberies were less about, we talk about running out of money. They were less about not getting sick and much more about anger, and it took me some quality time in therapy to learn that was really about anger, and not anger at others. I had plenty of that, Chris. I blamed everybody, the family court judge, my ex-wife, whoever. One of my brothers was a real jerk, I thought, to me during the time. Man, we blame other people when we're in the compulsion of addiction. But really, the anger was at me. I was angry at myself, for not getting the help I needed. I know it sounds so cliche, but people have to ask for help. And when I speak nationally to different groups. That's what I talk about. It seems so easy, and there's more to it than that. And I walk people through every day in my current job, in hobbies that I do, to do just that. I know I got off the track there a little bit, but I mean, that's important stuff.
Absolutely. Well, so in the end, I think you committed a total of 8 robberies. And eventually, obviously, at this point, you were caught. I think that they identified your truck and you were chased down by police cars and helicopters and taken at gunpoint. You were sentenced to 5.5 years in prison for your 8 robberies. To me, that seems a little bit light for so many offenses. You, of course, are a very experienced lawyer. So were you at all involved in your own defense? And was the sentence you received kind of standard for your crimes, do you think?
Well, and I don't mean to be flippant, but the sentence was exactly what I calculated when I looked up the guidelines, except I made one mistake. And listen, I don't want to come off, as cocky or this is like not important stuff or it's not serious what I did. I live with the guilt and the shame of what I did daily.
Yes.
I'm not proud of any of this, but I had to figure out a way to turn this around to possibly, and I don't even know if I do, but help others, to bring down the stigma. And we'll talk about it in a second, but bring down that stigma. But I was so angry at myself, man, that, it had so much more to do about mental health and those challenges for me than it did about addiction.
Mhm. So obviously your time in prison couldn't have been easy for you, despite you claiming to be somebody who could do prison time. But it probably ultimately saved your life in the end. Um, Briefly describe that period of time before you were released.
I'm writing my book about it right now, a second
Mm.
book right now about it.
Mhm.
And it's the most dysfunctional system that we have in this country
Mm.
is our prison system. If you look at the mass incarceration of minorities, and I'm not here to be political, the facts are the facts.
Mhm.
Mandatory sentencing, draconian drug laws in their sentencing. Prisons are filled with poor Black men and Hispanic men. Okay. So I go to prison and, thank God Almighty that two things. One, I have a law degree and I can help people with their legal cases. I actually got a job as the law clerk in the prison. So, and the second thing that I'm grateful for is my Marine Corps training. Now, by no means am I a badass or a fighter or an MMA guy. I'm terrified of MMA guys. I don't know about you, but they just,
Yeah.
they're really amazing. But I was able to handle myself. And I tell the story occasionally. I got in 6 fights in my prison career, and I was my record was 4-3. No, not 4-3. It was 4-2-1. I know that adds up to 7, but we don't need to talk about it. But anyway, so I go in. Here's the biggest thing. I'm a former prosecutor with the Justice Department. I'm in federal prison. Everybody in federal prison was prosecuted by a DOJ lawyer. If they found that out, I could be killed. As simple as that. And killing in certain communities, I don't want to say cultures, but certain communities, and this isn't race, this is not black, white, or whatever. It could be the, organizations, killing in certain organizations, okay? Because I don't want to sit here and talk about gangs for obvious reasons. Isn't a big deal.
Yeah.
And to kill me, that could be their initiation into an organization, or they could just be insane, or they could blame me for their ridiculously long sentence for marijuana or, a nonviolent offense. So anyhow, I always had that to worry about, because what people would do routinely is say, okay, I want to find out who this guy John Smith is. There's ways for them to find out who he is. They can get newspaper articles sent in. And, you know, so every now and then you'll find out so-and-so was a cop, you know, you don't want to be law enforcement in prison. So that never happened to me, you know, but I was prepared for it if it did happen. And I had to stand up for myself no matter what. And everybody in prison does. The one thing my buddy Matt told me when I asked him if I could do time, he goes, oh, someone's going to check you. Someone's going to step to you. It's inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes, you got to fight. He said, even if you get your ass kicked, it doesn't matter. You have to fight, you know, and that's how it actually happened for me. But I realized there's a possibility. It gave me a whole new understanding of prison and poverty and, you know, mass incarceration and the injustice that we're doing to people. The other point I'll make is, in terms of mental health and addiction, the percentages of people in the Federal Bureau of Prisons that have either one or both of those issues in their lives is unbelievable. They say, you know, maybe 60% in that. No. I'm this is anecdotal because I didn't do an actual study, but Chris, we're talking 80 to 90%.
Sure.
Particularly mental health. Absolutely. Trauma, PTSD from childhood. And so it gave me a new perspective. It also gave me an opportunity to help people, you know, not everybody, you know, but with habeas corpus petitions, direct appeals, you know, complaints against the prison warden and BOP in general. And that was the thing. One of the key points of how I was able to persevere and get through that. It was not easy. It's not club fed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I want to move on to the next chapter of your life after you got out of prison, after you survived prison, I guess. And this is what I find so inspirational about your story. We've talked about a lot of really horrible things in your life. But once you got out of prison, you really managed to turn your life around. Clean and sober, as far as I know, for a long time. And you're doing great work. Could you talk a bit about what you're doing now?
So when I was in prison, one of my things was to journal. And I recommend journaling for anybody. And people say, well, what do you write about? Write about anything. Put a pen to paper and just start writing. It gets it from here somewhere else. So I journaled, and after about, you know, towards the end of my time, I had a stack of those black and white speckled composition books you use when you're kids. And I had a stack of those full of my thoughts, you know, stories, memories, everything. And it really helped me from a mental health standpoint. So I get out and I go, I didn't know what to do. You know, I had a friend named Jim Walsh before I went in to prison. And towards the end of my time, I wrote to him and I said, can you get me a job as your paralegal? I'll carry your briefcase. You know, he's a wonderful, wonderful attorney, wonderful man. And it was important for me to tell the prison, look, I have something set up when I leave. You know, it helps like the halfway house process after prison and all these things. So that's what I started to do. I mean, he really threw me a lifeline. And so I started to rebuild, and I started doing legal work for other attorneys. I clearly wasn't licensed, but I had a skill set that they could use. So my one friend, another excellent lawyer, for better or for worse, all my friends are lawyers. You know, it's not, I don't know whether that's good or bad, but Brian picks up one of my composition books and he's kind of flipping through it. And he reads one of this. He goes, oh my God, that's awful. And so he keeps reading. He goes, and he starts laughing. He goes, that's hilarious. And he said, why don't you write a book? And I'm like, okay, I can't write a book, you know, it's like smart people write books. And so anyhow, I started to boil it down, and my partner, Dawn, helped me. And my sister, who's passed away a couple of years ago, she really drove me. She was an English major, one of the brightest people I've ever known. And she's like, keep going, send me another chapter. She lived in Texas, I lived in New York. And so it started to form into something cohesive. And it's a series of stories. It's not about bank robberies, right? I think there's one chapter that describes, I think, my first robbery, but it's not about that.
Well, let me mention
really
the name. Let me mention the name. Yeah. You're talking about your memoir called Sheer Madness: From Federal Prosecutor to Federal Prisoner, correct?
Correct. Yeah. And so I wrote it, and I probably sent out like 100 query letters to prospective literary agents. And, when they say, when you send us the query letter with the sample chapter, send a self-addressed envelope so we can send you back the rejection. And so it's sure enough, it's like law school or med school. You get a lot of rejections. You got to keep trying. And then finally, a friend said, well, why don't you use a platform called Create Space? You have a lot of control over it. You keep profits, whatever. And so it became a book. And I was happy, it was really a journaling exercise. It turned into a book. And so all of a sudden, I did a book signing, and somebody from the local press was there, and they reached out to me. And so it started to turn into a platform for me to speak, and I love to speak. And it gave me a platform to try to reach people a little bit and say, you know what, you can do this. Look how crappy things were for me, and certainly things aren't perfect, but you can do this, and kind of here's how. But that's not it's not a self-help book. It's just my story. There's no narrative arc to it, so don't look for one. So I started
I think that,
Chris, and
go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think that your story is kind of inspiring to a lot of people because, honestly, you don't hit bottom much worse than your story. Not only were you wildly addicted to drugs, especially heroin, you were robbing banks, you were endangering people, you were incredibly mentally unhealthy. You were just living at the bottom, and lucky for you, you got yourself into prison and you kind of figured some things out. Well, you're doing great work, Andrew. It's really inspiring. This has been a fascinating discussion for me. Thanks for sharing your story, and thank you for joining me today on Meet My Inspiration.
Chris, it's been an incredible pleasure. Can I say one last message?
Yes, please.
To listeners, you can do this. If you're struggling with mental health, addiction, seek out help, seek out treatment. I work for a place, and this is not a plug. I just happened to find a treatment place called Transformations Treatment Center. Find quality treatment. There's a lot of crappy treatment out there. Find quality treatment and get the help. You can do this. And I sound like that guy on the treadmill, but you really can. There's hope. You got to put in the work, but there's hope, and just keep trying and do not give up. I mean that.
That's an excellent message.
From my
Thank you
heart.
for sharing that. Okay. Andrew,
Absolutely.
Thanks again.
Chris,
this has been
you.
Great. My pleasure. Thanks to Andrew for such an honest and compelling discussion. Andrew's memoir, Sheer Madness: From Federal Prosecutor to Federal Prisoner, can be found on Amazon using the link below. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Meet My Inspiration, and I hope we've been able to inspire you too, even if just a little. Sometimes that's all it takes to make great things happen.